So today we'll be looking at industry and industrialization and the experience of our family members in the past who would have been industrial workers. And over the succeeding weeks, what we'll be doing is looking at other contexts. So next week, my colleague Barry Sheehan, who's from Cork, will be exploring whether the context, if you had a family member who was involved in a crime, and he'll be looking at police and criminals and the justice system. And then I'll be back for the next 3 weeks to look at church going and what that involved and the sources that you can use to find your family around religion and churches and congregations. And then I'm adding 2 new lectures onto the end. One looking at shops and shopping and the whole, I think there's been quite a lack of attention on shops and businesses and small businesses in sort of towns across the north of Ireland. So we'll be looking at sort of family environments in that context, and then finishing off with a look at our health and looking at doctors and hospitals and how hospitals can, and hospital records and health records can tell us a bit about our family members in the past. So hopefully in each of these lectures you'll get a sense of the background to the subject, like I said, some directions to finding and using relevant source material to uncover your own family, and some examples of how you might try things on your own. And so I think the thing to think about is that sometimes, well, I do worry sometimes that people are, that my approach is not traditional when coming to family history, because it's not about just looking at or telling you where you can find sources. It's about working an example up and using sources that you might not have conventionally thought to use. But that's because I'm convinced that you pretty much never know where you might find information about a family member. It could be in a whole range of different documents. And the story I always tell is that our family were the Ogilvies from Kilwaughter. Our family history as growing up in Canada was always that we had a family member who was the head gardener at Kilwaughter Castle, which, if you're an immigrant in Canada, is a big deal and is almost like being a member of the landed gentry. So we had a little postcard of Kilwaughter Castle, and on the back it had, in my grandmother's handwriting, great-grandfather was head gardener here. And I never believed that story ever. And if you look at the census in 1901, there's no Ogilvy who's listed as head gardener at Kilwaughter Castle as part of the family. And so, and in other records I've poked around it, you can see there's deer park keeper and there's all sorts of other roles on the estate, but no Ogilvies actually occupying those roles. So I was convinced that it was just a folktale until I was actually looking in the records of a grant application being made for the rebuilding of the National School in Kilwaughter. And because there was a problem over the property, and because the owner, the Countess Balzani, who was the inheritor of the Kilwaughter estate, because she died halfway through the grant application process, there was a question over the title to the property. Did the governors have the authority to build a school on this property? So they had to go to the Kilwaughter Balzani estate and ask them for their title, which they did by providing all of the wills of all of the inheritors of the Kilwaughter Castle estate. And sure enough, in one of those wills was a list of, the word's gone out of my head, when you give money in a will to someone, you bequeath. Thank you. And to my great-grandfather, who was, whose position isn't listed, but he's given £50 as a reward, really. So it's clear that he was somebody on the estate, and it was clear that he was potentially somebody important. So potentially a gardener. So it's not quite a confirmation that he was head gardener, but there's definitely somebody there. But it was found in educational records miles away from a traditional genealogical source. So I try to be really open to where I might find something about a family member. So let's go and talk a bit about industrial workers now. I hope this is the right version of this presentation. Anyway, so what I want to do, this doesn't look right, but we'll have to press on anyway. So when we're talking about, I'm just going to turn that off for a second. So we're going to talk about industry today and industrialization, because of course here in the heart of Titanic Quarter you can't get away from the fact or fail to be impressed by the industrial heritage of Belfast and all the hard work of all the many thousands of people who worked in the shipyards which made those massive steamships possible and which led to Belfast being an international centre for shipbuilding. Despite the fact it didn't have a great port, it was too small and too shallow. Other sites had developed earlier and become bigger. Belfast was still able to compete effectively. So the question is really, why Belfast and why the north of Ireland? Because the traditional picture, of course, is that the rest of Ireland failed to industrialize in the course of the 19th century. And I think what's happening now is that historians are realizing is that picture is too simplistic and that it needs to be challenged somewhat. We need to acknowledge the extent of what's called industrial activity in the 18th century. And we need to move away from this notion of an industrial revolution that happens in a very short period of time. And that it is something that was meant to happen very quickly. Instead, we should probably have an understanding of industrialization as a process which takes place over at least 200 years. And that there's lots of continuity and survivals of old ways of working up and alongside all these new ways of working. But what's always been true is the very vulnerable nature of industrial development here in the north of Ireland. Without large supplies of natural resources, without these, Irish industry was always open and dependent on imports of raw materials. And without a large domestic market to consume all these goods, then Irish industries were always dependent on exporting their products abroad, which during times of war and political upheaval could have been problematic and complicated. So, what is industrialization then? And someone's always got a definition for something. So, back in the 1970s, Tilly and Scott, a couple of sort of sociological historians, define industrialization as a movement of labor and resources away from primary production towards manufacturing production. This increased scale is achieved by mechanization and the movement of work out of the home and into factories. And so what they managed to encapsulate in that definition is some of the key aspects of the industrial process. You're talking about the movement of labor, resources, away from primary production, which means in essence making it for yourself or your family or for your immediate community. And you're moving away from that towards manufacturing production. Production on a grand scale that you're going to give most of away or sell most of to other people, consumers. This increased scale, the ability to make so much more than you actually need, is made possible by mechanization, the introduction of machines. And in the 19th century, this was made possible through the invention of steam power, and eventually then forwarded by the development of electricity. And so with all of the machines, we can make so much more. It doesn't cost so much, so it's relatively cheap to buy. And but in order to make these things at large scale, you need a big place to do it in. So you need a factory, and you need machines, and you need money to purchase all of that. And work therefore moves out of the home, where it had been done traditionally, into factories or purpose-built premises where work takes place. Okay? So that's kind of roughly a generic definition of really what is happening with the process of industrialization. And I think we can already see examples of how that's definitely happened here in the north of Ireland. But if we looked at Ulster in the 18th century, and we look at the countryside across Ireland in general, already there was lots of industrial type activity, in the sense that manufacturing, the construction of things, rather than the growing of things, is taking place. But the difference really is that a lot of it is small scale, a lot of it is domestic, a lot of it is for home or for regional consumption. And in this respect, we're talking about handwork, okay? But there's other aspects in the countryside. So for example, mills, where people would have taken their corn to be ground into flour. That's an industrial process, and a mill was seen as an industrial complex. Same thing true with forges for the smithing of iron. And then finally, the issue of textile production, the weaving and the spinning of cloth and yarn. This would have all been done by hand, though, or using water power if it was a mill. And so most towns and areas across Ulster in the 18th century would have had a diverse range of industrial activity taking place. There would have been a brewery, say, for example, or a distillery. There may have been a rope works. There would have been blacksmiths. There would have been mills and forges of various kinds. And all of this local industry flourishes because the locality needs to have each one of these productions nearby. Road networks aren't great. None of these industries can produce at scale to provide for the needs of the entire country. So you need someone who's local, who can make your shoes for you, or who can grind your corn for you. And so all across Ulster, you can really see, in the 18th century, a range of industrial activity. And if you look at the Ordnance Survey maps, they mark the mills, and in particular, the corn and the flax mills, as sites on them. Now, over the course of the 18th century, landlords in particular tended to look favorably upon industrial production. For them, they saw that as investment. Okay, so they sought to quite often subsidize or even fund industrial investment on their estates. They sponsored, so there's the famous Lisburn Flemish weavers who are encouraged to come and set up weaving. Landlords provided startup capital for a range of industrial activities, and so on and so forth. So for example, in terms of linen, a number of landed gentry established a linen board in 1711, and work with the government to reduce duties and taxes to try and encourage the growth of an Irish linen industry. And this indeed takes place. And as we know, linen in particular grows and develops in Ulster over the course of the 18th century. And by the 1780s, there's an extensive domestic textile production system, which some historians refer to as an industry almost, in that many rural Ulster farmers would have combined textile weaving alongside their farming duties, and they would have made more linen than they could have used, which they would have then sold at a local market. This farmer weaver has become sort of a classic icon within Northern Irish history. And of course we can't forget as well in this picture the importance of the female spinner, in that in order to provide all of this weaving with the raw materials, many women took to their spinning wheels, and many of them, and the spread of female spinning on a industrial scale spreads really well far down into the south and the west of Ireland as well. So all of this activity leads to what again historians refer to as early market characteristics. You get the emergence of middlemen, brokers who will buy woven webs from a farmer and then sell it at a market, or you've got bleachers who work in the same way too. And these individuals tend to organize themselves around the linen halls in key towns. Coleraine had one, Belfast had one, lots of other places did too. And like I said, the bleachers and the finishers as well, they needed lots of chemicals. They, in order to make the linen white, and they needed therefore capital and investment, so they become the drivers of this early move towards a market process for textiles, and the move towards larger scale production. And it's many of these individuals, the drapers, the middlemen, the bleachers, and the finishers, who feature in the early industrial production of textiles. But of course, in all of this, it relies on technological change. Okay, something that maybe we don't always consider is the importance of machines, and the importance of the development and the invention of machines which can work more quickly. So here you can see an example of an early spinning jenny, and how the fact that this one spindle here is what one woman would have been able to spin before, but now she's got, you know, many that she can spin all at the same time. Now, all of these inventions affected the cotton industry first. By the 1780s, there was great enthusiasm amongst entrepreneurs and wealthy merchants for starting cotton factories in Ireland. And much of this initial development, industrial development, again, doesn't take place in the north, but it takes place in the south. Particularly, and probably the best example, please, there's another machine, just to give you an idea what they're like. Yes. Okay. The best example is the cotton complex at Portlaw in County Waterford, which was set up by the Quaker family, the Malcolmsons. And as you can see, this was built in 1825. This is really a massive industrial building. The number of people who would have worked here would have been substantial. But this was a cotton factory. Throughout this period, the early 19th century, there was also a similar boom in cotton and the construction of factories throughout East Ulster. Particularly 10 mills were built in Belfast between 1800 and 1810, and substantial mills were built also at Bangor, at Millbrook in Kilwaughter in Larne, where my family comes from, and at Carrickfergus. And the location for all of these is significant in that they had easy access then to markets in England. And the number of spindles and the amount of cotton that's imported into Ireland by 1810 increases exponentially. But after about the mid-1820s, this industry begins to decline, although the decline is slower in Belfast. And there's a big depression in 1825, which hits the industry hard. And also in 1825, James Kay, a Scottish inventor, invents what's called the wet spinning process, the ability to add water to the process of spinning flax, which allows flax fibers for the first time to be spun by machines, and therefore to be spun into finer weights, and to be used for a greater variety of woven fabrics at the end. So with this sort of technological shift and all the rest, a number of entrepreneurs shift their production away from cotton and into the wet spinning of flax. And so from about the 1820s, you see the slow but steady growth of flax spinning mills emerging in the north of Ireland. Some of the cotton factories simply closed and go out of business, and some specialized. And throughout then the rest of the 19th century, Belfast, rather than spinning cotton, tends to feature in the finishing of cotton. It's too difficult to compete with English cotton spinning, but they can compete at the higher end of the market, at the finishing end. So it's really from the 1830s then that linen production begins to take off in Ireland. And textile production in general is really the first to mechanize, and is the first time that we really see these sort of industrial conditions, factory production on a grand scale. And spinning it takes place in mills, as everybody knows, and weaving then takes place in factories. And so sort of the 1850s and in the 1860s is when linen really begins to take off. Of course, you can see what's happened to Portlaw's cotton factory today, and then full mechanization about what we're talking about this period about right now. So the expansion of spinning takes place first, and eventually, though, power weaving, the application of steam power to the weaving process, then takes off later. And between 1861 and 1865, when the American Civil War was taking place, there was a cotton famine. Cotton imports were slowed down substantially by the disruption of the Civil War, and this led to a growing demand for linen. And this is really then the time when the linen industry in the north of Ireland, and in Belfast in particular, began to take off. So much so that even areas outside of Belfast became economical, and there was a steady growth in weaving factories outside of the city. Nevertheless, about 80% of the power loom weaving trade took place in Belfast. And in the 1871 census, when the population of Belfast is maybe, I don't know, 170, 80, 200,000 possibly, 8,500 people returned themselves as industrial workers in linen alone. By 1873, Belfast has become a world leader in linen production with over 800,000 to 900,000 spindles in operation. And this was a position then which Belfast held until about 1914. And the success of linen that led to a range of spin-offs. So you had a whole range of different companies establishing themselves, specialists, specializing in certain aspects of the trade. Some of the businesses grew to international scale proportions, like the York Street Mills and the Ulster Spinning Company became international in scale. And this then led to a whole range of other activities, such as, for example, the growth of banking in the north, the emergence of additional new technologies, and the building and construction of industrial villages in places like Sion Mills, for example, where the entire village was devoted to the production in the village factory. But problems were really never very far away, in that the north of Ireland relied on flax imports. It relied on low labor costs and minor, if any, unionization, and it relied on stable markets and the ability to move goods around Europe and America. And all of this changed then in World War I, when the First World War broke out. And afterwards, also many Ulster firms found it difficult to adapt and went under. Many of them were simply unable to manage the import of flax requirements that were needed. But we mustn't just concentrate our analysis of industry by looking at textiles, because a whole range of other industries emerged too. Engineering, Belfast had a significant rope works. There was Gallagher's Tobacco Company, there was the soft drinks, Cantrell and Cochrane, banking, railways, and of course printing too, Marcus Ward in particular. And of course, I've left shipbuilding then to last. Because of course, Harland and Wolff and Workman Clark were the biggest Belfast-based shipping firms, and they were able to benefit from their location within the UK, which became a hub between Clydeside and Southampton. They were able to benefit from family contacts and networks that they had in order to develop their business, which we all know became huge, covered 80 acres of this whole area by about 1912. But I wanted to talk a little bit about post-partition problems, because of course the war didn't help. And then in the years after 1922, there was excess capacity, growing foreign competition, a lack of raw materials, harder to access export markets, and all the rest. Now, it's not to say that there wasn't some reprieve in World War II. There was. Mackey's in particular shifted to the manufacturing of munitions, employing 12,000 people by 1945. Harland and Wolff, slightly less successful at adjusting to war, but they too also became massive employers of people in the north of Ireland. So, Wolff, 1950 we got in slightly less than half an hour. So the whole idea really was to just kind of give you a bit of a background, a bit of an overview to the process of industrialization and to see where we got to, so that if you're having a family, if you have a family member who's involved in the industry, you can kind of get a sense. So what I want to do now is I want to look at the two kind of components of the this industrial occupational group. I want to look at the employers first, because some people might get lucky and have someone who was or is or owned an industrial enterprise, and then look at the employees and the workers at the end. But I also think too that it's actually helpful if you're doing history of your family to look not only at your standard genealogical sources, but to look at the firms where your family may have been employed, if indeed you're lucky to find out what that was. Because PRONI has an amazingly comprehensive collection of business records. And back in the 1950s, which I'm sure Ian doesn't quite remember, but PRONI was asked to do a survey of business records, which led to them developing a list of almost 1,000 firms which had significant archives. Now I'm quoting this directly from your little hand list, which is the Ulster textile industry, right? Which is still, do you still use it, or it's gotten incorporated? You know that. So it's just in the introduction where Brian Traynor says how he came about to develop this list of archives, and as a result, he created the little catalog related to called the Ulster Textile Industry, which lists about 250 collections of business records related to industrial companies and businesses. And the introduction, I think, rightly points out that alongside these records of businesses and the firms themselves go, in fact, three types of related records, I think, which we don't always think about. One is tax records. The other one is bankruptcy records, the BANK series and the CON series. And I would also then add to that the solicitors' papers and records. Because again, if you have a business, you probably at one time or another needed a lawyer. And again, PRONI's got quite a lot of solicitors' collections and papers deposited. And all of these records can generate really very useful information about families, relations, about the rising, declining fortunes of family. We've always wondered, why did our family emigrate in 1905 when they did? And I think it's probably that, you know, their firm went bankrupt or was, you know, restructuring or something along those lines. So what I want to do is I want to just use 3 case studies of 3 family firms to talk a bit about the experience of employers. Okay, so I want to look at Gribbons of Coleraine, and then I want to look at the McFerrins, who ran a flax spinning enterprise outside Kilwaughter, and then I want to look at David Dunseath of Belfast, and who also owned a bleach works in Kilwaughter as well. And I think they use different sources to say interesting things about both the owners' families and the people who work for them. I should say that that the archives that you might find when you call up your records can be really patchy, and it might be something as little as that, which is really not very much, particularly given that half of those books are written in some sort of linen language, which I do not understand. Ticks and scribbles and notes, and you know, and because it's written around in the back of somebody's hip pocket, right? But you could get very lucky and find quite a lot of material. I haven't yet had that pleasure yet. You know, this was kind of another stash of records that I found for the McFerrins, I think, and. You know, but still, you never know, right? So, to go to the Gribbons and talk a bit about the Gribbons. The Gribbon company is was very much run as a family-based company. It was founded by Edward Gribbon, who was a merchant and a Baptist from Coleraine, who through a couple of, I think, kind of shady business dealings, of which I can't really quite get the grasp of, is able to expand his business, and he buys property on the shore front of the River Bann, right in the heart of Coleraine next to the old bridge. This business expands. It's called Edward Gribbon and Son, in the sort of between the 40s and the 50s. And then in the 1860s, what he does is that he buys a bleach green, or he leases it on a long lease, out in Dunseath, which is sort of 5 miles out into the countryside. He has 8 children, 7 of whom are sons. And one of his sons dies when he was about 19. The other one I don't know anything about. And one goes into the British Army. The other 4 are all involved in the family linen business in some way, shape, or form. So Alexander comes to Belfast with his family, and he's in charge of the warehouse, which almost all linen firms would have had in the 19th century. John runs the Coleraine operation until he dies, when his brother Henry A takes it over. And then you have William. And William moves to the United States to look after their new branch operation there, which operated between 1871 and 1895. Now, the archive, like I said, is reasonably substantial, but it's kind of patchy. You can look at it if you're interested, but I think it reveals very, very much about the Gribbon family, their interests, their passions, and touches on all sorts of interesting characteristics. So, for example, the Gribbons were great Baptists, very, very active within the Northern Baptist community, and a couple of the family members serve as secretaries of the Baptist Missionary Association, and so there are Baptist Missionary Association records in this little business archive. And you can find out, again, quite a lot about what it was like to be not Presbyterian, but still Protestant in the north of Ireland, if you know what I mean. The one son who went to serve in the British Army, George has an extensive correspondence with his family, which is also included here. Interestingly, George served in the Afghan War, both the first one and the second one, and writes very descriptive letters about the Afghan War. So touching again on a whole other area of history. The archive also includes wage books and time books and putting out books and quite a lot of bankruptcy and wind-up papers, including inventories, valuations, plans of the factory, when they wanted to expand and all the rest of it, valuations. But probably of most interest for us is the correspondence between Henry Gribbon and what looks to be like his senior manager, Winship, in 1883 in the United States. Now Winship seems to be working underneath William, okay, the other brother, and is convinced that William is running the business into the ground. And his correspondence, which is hilarious, which I have forgotten to bring with me, repeatedly says to Henry, you must get rid of William. He calls him WG. WG must go. If you ever want to have a high-class house in New York that will compete with the Americans, you must get rid of William. He's odd, he's peculiar, he has no head for business. But does the Gribbon family do anything about William? No, they don't. William survives Winship and continues to lead the business well after he's gone. So you can see how these sorts of tensions within a family business can really affect the success or otherwise of a business. I want to move on to talk about the McFerrins and the Millbrook premises. I mean, Millbrook has a long and complicated history because I don't think it's a very good site. It's been a bleach green and a cotton factory, then it moved into linen, it was then split up into two and re-emerged. It had a whole series of owners and occupiers. And it's interesting that the McFerrins in particular, who were from the area, had a long lease on the property. And William, the father, who died in 1870, also had 7 sons. And he set up his estate into a trust with John, his eldest son, as the key beneficiary. And when the mill became vacant because nobody wanted to continue with it, it reverted back to the estate. And 2 other brothers, Joseph Hunter and Thomas, agreed to take it on. And they made lots of alterations. They spent a huge amount of money. They went in, they bought new machines, they renovated the whole premises, they took over the bleach green, and made it all part of one business. They already had experience as being linen merchants and all the rest. But as the legal case, which is where I got all of this information from, says, Joseph Hunter, quote unquote, unfortunately entered upon some stock exchange speculation which resulted badly. And as a result, the firm went bankrupt and had to cease trading. The sources at PRONI are all legal documents relating to the case which John, the eldest son, takes against his two brothers in order to prevent the losses of their firm being chargeable to he and his mother's estate that they inherited from his father, right? Even though it's his brothers, okay? And he's basically saying that they ran up all of these bills and debts, and that was not part of the deal that they had originally agreed. The judge said, too bad, you're liable, and the state was then forced to pay for that. And then finally, to look at David Dunseath in the 1920s. David Dunseath seems to have died sort of before his time, shall we say, on the 12th of April, 1922. He was a linen merchant and seems to have been a broker and a dealer as well. He was based in Belfast and had premises in James Street South. But he also, as part of his very elaborate portfolio of businesses, owned Millbrook Bleaching and Finishing Company in Kilwaughter, which is again how I've come across him. Because really all I really know so far about the business is again a legal case that is taken in 1926 by his widow, Annie Olivia, against David's brother James and the business manager of the whole enterprise, George Shanks, in which she accuses them of deliberately trying to exhaust David's estate so that there's nothing left for her and her children. And what she says in her statement to the court is, she says, and all they're doing is giving each other elaborate Christmas presents, which are far more expensive than really ought to be. And so you can get a sense, really, I think, of the tensions and the difficulties of running a family business in Northern Ireland. So I think some of the problems I've listed here, clearly you've got problems of leadership and management, right? Is that if you're going to give your family jobs, they might not always be the best able to do it. Family relationships also can cause lots of problems. And while if you were the founder of your family firm and you've got 7 sons, you might think that might be great, but having lots of brothers is not something that's good for your business, you might say. Speculation and risk, too, is always going to be a problem. Overinvestment in machinery that you can't then later on afford. And not only that, but in Ulster, most firms were relatively small. Small to medium is what we would call them now. And they had less protection when hard times came along than someone bigger who could absorb losses in this way. So, I want to talk now a bit about the workers and hopefully bring this all home in the next sort of 10 to 15 minutes. I wanted to start off really by, I think, just reflecting a bit on the whole issue of occupations when we look at family history. The things or the jobs that our ancestors had in the past. Because really, I had a quick flick through my, albeit very limited, family history guidebooks, and really, occupational records don't feature very highly, or very much. Jonathan Barden's Guide to Local Studies in PRONI has a couple of pages which are quite useful. And John Grenham's kind of Tracing Your Irish Ancestors has a chapter on a range of limited occupational sources. I've also seen these guides to these books in the National Archives. My ancestor was a ... And again, so you can see how there are a range of potential sort of sources. But really, there's not a lot out there that sort of enables people, I don't think, to engage with the occupations of their family in the past. Now, this is kind of throwing it out there in the sense that I was trying to find a list of definitions of Irish occupations, say in the linen industry. And again, If anybody knows of one, a handy list, that would be great. And if this ever goes up on YouTube, then you can stick it at the bottom or contact me privately. But these sorts of things would be really handy to have. But the one place where I would direct people to, if you're looking to try and explore occupations or find your family in an occupational way, is the Ulster Historical Foundation's website, where you can see here they have a range of small and highly particular occupational databases. And what's interesting is, of course, a good range. Brown linen seal masters, apothecaries, agents, butchers, ballymoney stutchers, if we're thinking about industrial production. But you can see the number of records over here, sometimes only a handful. And not only that, but either self-employed people or people with a skill or a trade or employers, likely. So not so easy to find your family member through this way. But it made me think then that about the sort of the key sources that we might use if we were to explore the issue of occupations. And the ones I thought of off the top of my head were the censuses, 1901 and 1911, which list occupation. Civil registration quite often will include the occupation of the father. Okay. And I thought of wills, where sometimes the occupation, so, Sir X or Mr. X, farmer, for example. Can anybody think of anything else? Good sources, occupational descriptions? C, valuations, no.
Street directories?
Street directories, you're absolutely right, I must write that down. Okay, so you can get some, but it's not a lot. So what I wanted to do, how can we try and unpick this a bit? Or maybe use what we've got in those sources to best advantage? I thought it might be useful, first of all, to kind of just talk briefly about the living and working conditions of for people like this. Because of course we all know the broad general view, okay? And I don't want to spend time going into details about that. Because everybody's, I'm sure, familiar with them. And they're very easy found in any textbook or historical account of the linen industry in the north of Ireland, in any history of Belfast, like Bill Maguire's Belfast or Stephen Broyle's recently published history, and I've written them on the back of your books. So if you're looking for sort of a general description of occupations or what life was like for industrial workers in the mid to late 19th century, then you can find it all there. And what all of these sources point to is the rapidly expanding population of Belfast, the need for new houses, the decline in living and working conditions as a result, the poverty and the poor health, and all of that. So I want to talk first of all about housing a little bit. And again, Bill Maguire's got a great section really on housing, where he talks about as the population of Belfast, if we just use that as an example, growing sort of between 1861 and 1901, where the population trebles in Belfast to 350,000 people. And that how early in this process, mill owners did get involved in the construction of houses. But many of these houses were very bad and were of very poor condition. But Belfast was unique in that there was a series of key sort of bylaws and conditions that required landowners of working class housing to pay for rates and repairs. And so many mill owners soon saw that it was uneconomical to get involved in the construction of housing. And so in fact, after about the 1870s then, most of the mill housing that's constructed, or working class housing I should say, that's constructed in Belfast is built by property developers, estate agents, and land speculators. And these houses, the kitchen terraces and the kitchen terraces like you would see up at PRONI, the housing that you still kind of see floating around in Belfast is exactly the kind of thing that was being built. And while these houses weren't great, they weren't bad like, say, in Glasgow or in Manchester, places where you had back-to-backs, where there was no back entry. Almost all of Belfast's housing had back entries, which is kind of seen by historians as a marker of, poor, but not terribly exploitative. So what I wanted to do was just to then look at the census return then for the Horner family, and just to get a sense of the occupations that they occupied. So we can see here from 1901 that Martha Horner with her 2 daughters, Lizzie and Minnie, are living in Heron Street, which is just off the Falls Road, just kind of behind Dunville Park, and right in the heart of the industrial textile production in West Belfast. And you can see that all 3 of them are flax and employed in industrial occupations. If you, I'm sorry, I had an idea for this, which has now kind of escaped me, because then I wanted to look here at the Form B1, and I don't know again how many people use Form B1, but it's dead handy to give you an idea of the quality of the house. So it tells you here, house 4, that it's built, that it's a private dwelling, and through a series of calculations, you get to the figure of 6, and 6 then tots up to being a second-class house. So you know it's built of brick, it's got a slate roof, and has 3 windows to the front. You also can over here then tell the degree of crowdedness or otherwise. Martha Horner says that there are 4 rooms in her house and 3 people occupying those 4 rooms. If you look down, you can see all of her neighbors. Okay? Second-class houses all the way. Likely a terrace. It is. I've been. It's still there. And again, you can see that for the most part, there are 3 people living in most of the families. 6 sometimes, 4, 3, 2, and 5. So we're not talking like 12 or 15. And we're not talking about double family occupancy either. So it's poor, it's not fun, and it's not nice, but it's not horrible. So in this respect, then, I think housing is an interesting way, or you can sort of explore the housing conditions that your family lived in. So what I want to do now is just to talk a bit about sort of conditions. Because of course, what we've been talking about is really the birth of capitalism, isn't it? Where employers had, at this point in time, free rein. Long hours weren't really questioned. There was poor security of work, very strict rules. The machinery was often unsafe and there wasn't proper safeguards in place to keep people safe at work. Think about your pension. There was no pension. Very difficult to save. And wages could be exploitative and were openly gender biased in favor of men as opposed to women and children. Again, details of that whole environment are all described in the standard texts. But if you're trying to get a sense of what life was like for the lived person, you might actually find another couple of sources equally interesting. Okay? So I kind of divided them up into categories like the social observer. Okay? Middle class philanthropists who were anxious about what was happening to the poor, who then write accounts of what they see. And of course the most famous for Belfast is Reverend William Hanlon's Walks Amongst the Poor of Belfast, which you can actually view online as an ebook. Another great area to find all of this is government reports. That's like a whole other lecture to talk about how you might find material in there, but your local librarian is a really good place to start because they can help you begin to try and explore some of the government reports that were published around this time, investigations into the condition of working class housing. And what's actually really interesting is investigations into female working, in particular in the late 1890s, early 20th century, where lots of women who worked in factories gave evidence about their working conditions. But then I've got this third category here, which I've called personal reminiscences, in that we're lucky that there are a range of working class autobiographies, accounts written by working people themselves about what their life was like. And 2 of them are here. Robert McElborough's account of his involvement in the gas industry and then as a labor activist, and William Topping's account of himself as a as a damask worker, right? Both of which have been printed and published, and so you can kind of read them for yourselves. And William Topping turns out, when I was flicking through it there last night, to have actually worked in Millbrook factory for about 8 years. So I can actually use his account now to bolster my own understanding of the factory, probably where my family worked 10 or 15 years earlier, which is something which I had never known, and this has sat on my shelves for at least 20 years, I'm sure. I also want to pick up the accounts by Michael McClaverty, the novels Call My Brother Back and Lost Fields, which I think are hugely evocative of the Catholic experience, which again can be at times difficult to access. He writes very emotively, I think, about life on the Falls Road. And while he doesn't concentrate on industrial experiences per se, they're in the background all the time. And finally then, Betty Messenger's fine work, where she interviews in the 1960s women who worked in the 30s, 40s, and 50s in the linen industry, and recounts their stories, songs, and traditions throughout. So, in the sort of the few minutes remaining to me, I wanted to just give you an example then of my family and their experiences, I guess, and how I've explored that through the source material. So this is the Martin family, around about 1906. It's probably not they're from Kilwaughter. It's probably Canada, actually, where this was taken. And the matriarch in the center is Ellen Martin, whose maiden name was Shilliday. She was born in outside Dromore, County Down, in the parish of Mackerally, and she married another farmer called Hugh Martin, and the two of them seem to, after their marriage, have moved into Dromore town, where he became a weaver. I presume in a factory, because I've only recently kind of discovered that. What happens very tragically is that within about 8 or 9 months, both her husband and her 5th child, Ellen, die. If you want to get a sense of the family, there it is, roughly speaking. So here's Ellen marrying Hugh. They have Samuel Martin and 4 other children. And in the mid-1880s, her 5th child dies and her husband dies kind of within about 3 or 4 months of each other. And she's left, and she seems to, at that stage, then move to Kilwaughter. So her sons all grow up there, and they get jobs in the Kilwaughter Millbrook weaving establishments. And you can see then, if I'll come back to, but Ellen's family herself, the Shillidays, are equally interesting because of their movement from the land into the industries. In that here's Ellen over here. You can see that she had a younger brother, Isabella, and Charles Martin, another brother, or her brother. And in each one of these, while James Shilliday is listed as a farmer, and while Hugh is also listed as a farmer, and he is a farmer, the rest of them all end up in textiles of one shape or form or another. We know what happens to Ellen, right? She eventually becomes a linen worker in her own right after she becomes a young widow. Isabella marries a farmer, but this relationship seems very odd to me, for she ends up in the 1911 census living with her son John as a folder of handkerchiefs. I think a sign of the continued existence of putting out and handwork within the textile industry. Although John is living on his farm next door, or several parishes over. Charles Martin's very interesting as well, for he seems to have moved to Belfast as a young man, become a hoist driver, and does that. His son becomes an apprentice linen lapper, and we see him appearing in the censuses as well. Okay, so if you look at the Martins, they're equally interesting too. Sorry, that's Ellen's. But the Martins are interesting too, in that everybody arrives all up in Kilwaughter, and they all work in Kilwaughter bleaching and finishing, and then for some reason they decided to emigrate to Canada, and we think that it was either the firm went bust or they were asked and invited to go to Canada to start work in a linen textile factory in Northern Ontario. So here you can see their emigration record. You can see there's James Martin up at the top, who's one of the brothers, and under that his brother Hugh, and then his children and family. Then these are their neighbors, okay? This is the younger sister of his wife. And then finally down here, this is what I want to mention or touch on, is Ellen Martin. She lists herself as 45, but she's at least 5 or 8 years older than that. And over here, I'm trying to work out what it is that she's meant to be. And I think that the person filling out the form originally was trying to write down housewife or housekeeper, potentially, because it looks like house. But I think it's been scratched out and has written instead mechanic. Because again, since the 1880s, she's been working in a factory providing for her family. So I think that that's kind of interesting, actually. A mechanic is clearly their standard description for a factory worker, rather than because the other Ogilvies and the Martins were all weavers of some kind or another. The final kind of source, so emigration sources can also kind of throw up, I think, some interesting things. So I wanted to just look very quickly then at the Ogilvies. Now, and to talk a bit about this type of source, which is the wage book or time books. These were, in essence, personnel records. They listed the names of employees, gave their ages, the hours worked, and the wages, obviously. But they can also help to identify occupations and give you a sense of what were traditionally male and female jobs and what was high-paid and low-paid work. So in the 1880s, in the Gribbon archive, there's a time book where you can see that the mechanics, the dressers, the warpers, and the weavers are all men, and women are winders or headlers. And the disparity in the income is substantial. The men are earning £2 and more per week, and the women are earning 5 shillings a week, or less. But what's also interesting too is what it reveals about our sense of work discipline, right? In the sense that for the week ending the 18th of July, 1889, 59 weavers are recorded as being off work that week, or off time. And you can also see throughout the time book how it shows that people were being fined for things like idling, quote unquote, shouting, throwing a ticket among the winders, for not lifting the weft off the counter, for not lifting plates of cards. You know, really small-scale stuff, it seems to me. But even in the 1930s, when the wage book from Kilwaughter line, which is here at PRONI, comes, you can still see this kind of flexibility in the work patterns of what I'm sure is my relative, William Ogilvie, although I'm not sure of his connection to me. Because if you look at the whole book, from start to finish, 1939 to 1952, William Ogilvie works at Kilwaughter line from at least the week commencing the 19th of May, 1939, when the book starts, and he works off and on until like the 1st of November, 1940. Okay, so some weeks he doesn't seem to be working at all, other weeks he seems to be back, which doesn't strike me as being very modern, or at all, really. Does he go into the army, say, in 1940? Does he emigrate? Maybe he just liked long holidays. Maybe it was just that there was no work for him that week. I don't know enough yet to be able to tell. But we can certainly see that from the entry, as you read it across, what he worked, the bonus he got for Christmas, the amount that he had to pay in national insurance. So it doesn't help me find his father or his connection to me, but it does tell me a little bit more about him, which hopefully most of the records and this talk has done to some extent. Okay, so thanks very much.